There is a moment near the end of Gus Fring's life where a bomb has just torn through a small room, and a man with half his face gone walks out into the hallway, stops and calmly straightens his tie before he falls. He does not scream, he does not run. In the last seconds he has on earth, the thing he reaches for is order, the same composure he carried into every room for years. It was the last thing he ever did. That single gesture says more about him than any line of dialogue ever could, and it points straight at the question this video exists to answer. Behind the fried chicken, behind the donations and the soft voice and the spotless suit, there was a whole way of seeing the world, a philosophy of control, of patience, of hiding in plain sight. Tonight, slowly and quietly, we are going to take that philosophy apart, piece by piece. Welcome to Between the Episodes. Let's get started. Section 1. The Man Who Hid in Plain Sight. The first time most people met Gustavo Fring, they did not know they had met anyone at all. He arrives quietly, late in the second season of Breaking Bad, in an episode that introduces him almost as a piece of background. There is a fast food restaurant, clean and bright, and a little dull, the kind of place that exists on every corner of every American town and asks nothing of the people who walk through it. There is a man behind the counter, or near it, dressed in a modest manager's shirt, wiping a table, asking a customer if the meal was all right. He is polite. He is forgettable. He is the sort of figure the eye slides right past because nothing about him asks to be looked at. And that, it turns out, was the whole point. The man wiping the table ran one of the largest drug operations in the southwest of the country, and he had built his entire life so that no one would ever guess it. The restaurant was Los Pollos Hermanos, which means the Chicken Brothers, and the man was Gus. To the city of Albuquerque, he was a success story of the quiet kind. He owned a chain of restaurants that people liked. He gave money to the local hospital. He sponsored events. He made large donations to the Drug Enforcement Administration itself, shaking hands with the very agency whose job it was to catch men like him, sitting at their fundraising dinners, smiling for their photographs. He was the kind of man a community is glad to have, the kind of man people point to as proof that hard work and decency still pay off. None of it was real in the way it appeared, and yet all of it was real enough to function. The donations were genuine. The chicken was genuine. The respectability was a working machine, and it ran for years without a single crack showing. Underneath that surface, he was something else entirely, a careful and ruthless distributor of methamphetamine, who moved his product across state lines through a network so disciplined that the people buying it had no idea where it came from. He kept himself at a great distance from the thing he sold. He almost never touched it, almost never stood near it, almost never let his name come close to it. He understood, better than almost anyone in his world, that the men who get caught are usually the men who let themselves be seen. So he arranged his life around the opposites principle. He would be seen constantly, in public, doing ordinary and admirable things, and the seeing itself would become his disguise. A man who is always in view, always accounted for, always smiling at a charity lunch, is the last man anyone suspects of running an empire in the dark. There is a line he says to Walter White, deep into their dealings, that captures the whole strategy in a handful of words. He tells Walt that he hides in plain sight. It is a simple phrase, almost a throwaway, and it is also the closest thing Gus ever gives to a confession of method. The best place to conceal something, he understood, is not in a locked room far away. The best place to conceal something is in the open, surrounded by witnesses, wrapped in a story so ordinary that no one bothers to question it. A locked room invites curiosity. A fried chicken restaurant invites nothing at all. Gus built his fortune on that single insight, and he held to it with a discipline that almost no one around him could match. To understand why this mattered so much, it helps to remember what the world of the show looked like before Gus walked into it. The criminals Walter White had dealt with up to that point were loud men. They were impulsive, violent in obvious ways, ruled by appetite and temper. The most memorable of them, a cartel enforcer named Tuco Salamanca, was a creature of pure volatility, a man who could laugh one second and beat someone to death the next, whose mood swung so wildly that no one near him was ever safe. That kind of criminal is frightening, but he is also fragile, because chaos cannot be planned around, and rage cannot be hidden. Men like that burn brightly and briefly. They draw attention, and attention in that world is death. Gus was the answer to all of that, the deliberate opposite of everything that came before him. Where Tuco was noise, Gus was silence. Where Tuco was a man who could not control himself for a single afternoon, Gus was a man who seemed never to lose control at all. Not once, not for a moment, across years of pressure that would have shattered anyone else. The show built him as a new kind of danger, the danger that does not look dangerous, the threat that wears a clean shirt and speaks softly and asks about your meal. He was created in part to fill the space left when the actor who played Tuco departed early in the series, and the writers used that opening to bring in something the show had not yet had. A villain whose power came from restraint. The man who gave Gus his body and his voice, the actor Giancarlo Esposito, understood this from the beginning, and he made a series of small choices that turned the character into something unforgettable. He has said in interviews that he made the decision to play Gus as graceful. Not flashy, not loud, not theatrical in the way that television criminals so often are, but graceful, controlled, economical in every movement. He chose to do less rather than more. He let silences sit until they grew uncomfortable. He kept his eyes still, while everyone around him darted theirs about in panic. He moved at a steady, even pace, never rushing, never dragging, the walk of a man who has decided exactly where he is going and sees no reason to hurry. He even practiced his lines in a whisper, searching for the menace that lives in quiet rather than in shouting. The result was a performance built almost entirely out of withholding. A man who frightened people, not by what he did, but by how much he was visibly choosing not to do. That stillness was the outward sign of an inner system, and the inner system is what this video is really about. Because Gus Fring was more than a well-dressed criminal with good manners. He was a man who lived by a set of beliefs, a working philosophy that touched every part of how he operated. He believed in control, total and constant, over himself first, and then over everything around him. He believed in patience, in the slow building of advantage over years, rather than the grabbing of it in a single, greedy moment. He believed in concealment, in the power of the mask, in the safety of being underestimated. He believed that a man proves himself through duty and discipline, rather than through display. And underneath all of it, driving the whole careful machine, he carried something he never spoke of directly, a wound so old and so deep that it had quietly organized his entire life around a single distant goal. These beliefs were not written on a wall somewhere for the audience to read. They had to be assembled slowly from the way he behaved, from the rare moments his mask slipped, from the handful of speeches the show allowed him, and from the backstory it doled out in careful pieces across 2 separate series. Gus is one of the most studied characters in modern television, precisely because he never explained himself. He left the work of understanding him to the people watching, and the more closely they watched, the more there was to find. A whole worldview sat behind those still eyes, and the show trusted its audience to dig it out. What makes him so compelling, and so worth slowing down to examine, is that his philosophy actually worked for a very long time. This was not a man stumbling through the criminal world, hoping to survive. He had designed a way of living that let him win, year after year, while the people around him destroyed themselves through impatience and ego and noise. He outlasted rivals who were richer and more violent than he was. He built infrastructure that none of them could match, a hidden laboratory beneath an industrial laundry, a distribution system disguised as a chicken supply chain, a public reputation so clean it functioned as armor. He did all of this while appearing, to the ordinary citizens of his city, to be nothing more than a generous local businessman. The philosophy was sound. It held weight. It produced results that the loud men could only dream of. And yet the same philosophy that built him would, in the end, be the thing that killed him, and that is the quiet tragedy sitting at the center of his story. The control that made him untouchable also made him rigid. The patience that let him wait for revenge also kept an old enemy alive long enough to become a weapon. The mask that hid him so well also hid him from himself until the one moment he let his pride show became the opening his enemies needed. Everything that lifted him up was viewed from a slightly different angle, the same thing that brought him down. His philosophy was not flawed because it was weak. It was flawed because it was complete, a closed system with no room left for the one thing he could not plan around, which was his own buried need to be seen winning at last. To take that philosophy apart properly, it has to be approached the way Gus approached everything, slowly and in order, one piece at a time. The stillness comes first, because it is the most visible thing about him and the foundation everything else rests on. The self-control that turned silence into a weapon and made a soft voice more frightening than any scream. From there, the picture widens. There is the code he spoke aloud to Walter White, the belief about duty and provision that he used to explain himself, and that Walt would borrow and twist into something darker. There is the patience, the willingness to wait years for a single outcome, illustrated by a childhood story he tells about a tree and a small animal that reveals more about him than he probably intended. There is the architecture of his concealment, the restaurants and the laundry and the donations, the whole elaborate machine of hiding in the light. There is his use of fear, precise and cold, the wordless violence he used as a kind of language. And there is the engine underneath it all, the loss that started everything, and the revenge that never stopped driving him forward. Each of these is a part of the same man, and each one connects to the others. The control feeds the patience. The patience serves the revenge. The concealment protects the empire that the revenge requires. The fear keeps the empire in line. These are not separate traits stacked on top of each other. They are a single integrated way of moving through a dangerous world, and the integration is what makes Gus so rare. Most criminals in fiction are bundles of impulses. Gus was a philosophy walking around in a clean shirt, and the philosophy was so consistent that it almost looked like peace. There is one more thing worth holding on to before going any deeper, because it shapes everything that follows. Gus Fring was a deeply private man, and much of what drove him was deliberately kept off the screen by the people who made him. His past in Chile the events that turned a poor boy into a man capable of all this, was left as a fog of hints and fragments that the writers never fully cleared. This was a choice, and it was part of his power as a character. The blankness made him larger. The unanswered questions made him harder to dismiss. A villain who is fully explained becomes smaller. A problem you can solve. A villain who keeps his deepest history hidden, even from the audience, stays dangerous because some part of him remains beyond reach. So as his philosophy gets taken apart, certain pieces will end in question marks, and those question marks are not gaps in the story. They are the story, placed there on purpose by writers who understood that a man who hides in plain sight should keep some things hidden even at the very end. That is the man waiting at the center of all this. A figure who served chicken with one hand and ran an empire with the other, who frightened hardened killers without ever raising his voice, who built a fortune on the simple idea that the safest place to stand is in full view. The smile was real, and the menace was real, and somehow both were true at the same time, held together by a discipline so complete that the seams never showed. Pulling those two halves apart and looking at the beliefs that let one man hold them together for so long is the work of everything that comes next. The place to begin is with the quietest and most powerful weapon he owned, the one he carried into every single scene, the stillness that made everyone around him afraid to move. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. We have met the man behind the counter, the smiling businessman who built an empire by being the last person anyone would ever suspect, and we have glimpsed the whole philosophy waiting underneath. Next, we look at the foundation it all rests on, the stillness Gus wore like armor. What seems like simple calm turns out to be the most carefully built weapon he ever carried. Section 2. Stillness as a weapon. Watch Gus Fring move through a room, and the first thing to notice is how little he does. He does not pace. He does not fidget. His hands do not wander to his pockets or tap against a table or rise to fix his hair. When he stands evenly, his weight settled, his arms hanging loose at his sides or folded with purpose in front of him. When he walks at one steady speed, never quickening, never slowing, a pace that says he will arrive exactly when he means to and not a second before. When he speaks, the words come out, measured and slow, broken into careful pieces, each one given its full weight before the next is allowed to follow. And when he has nothing to say, he says nothing, and lets the silence stretch out across the room until the other person, unable to bear it, fills the empty space with words they did not mean to speak. This is the foundation of everything Gus was. Before the empire, before the revenge, before the long game and the hidden laboratory, there was this: a man in complete command of himself. It is worth slowing down on this quality because it is easy to mistake for a small thing. Calmness on its own sounds almost gentle, almost passive, the trait of a man who simply does not get worked up. But the stillness Gus carried was nothing passive. It was active and deliberate, a thing he built and maintained with enormous effort, a discipline he applied to himself every waking moment. He was not calm because nothing troubled him. He was calm because he had decided long ago and permanently that he would never let anything that troubled him reach the surface. The composure was a wall, and behind that wall a great deal was happening, but the wall never came down, and the never coming down was the entire achievement. The actor who played him understood that the power of the character lived in restraint, and he made that restraint the heart of the performance. He chose to do less where another actor might have done more. He kept his eyes still while processing information, refusing to let them dart around the way frightened or scheming men do, so that even when his plans were being threatened, his face implied that he was fully in control of the adjustment. He learned to drink in the people across from him, to stare quietly until they grew flustered and gave away more than they intended. He found a strange and specific rhythm in the way Gus spoke, slowing down to land on certain syllables, breaking ordinary sentences into unusual shapes, so that even a simple word like acceptable came out stretched and deliberate, weighed and considered, as though the man saying it had examined every part of it before letting it go. He has spoken about practicing the lines in a whisper, hunting for the menace that hides in quiet, rather than the menace that lives in volume. The result was a man who could make a room full of armed and dangerous people fall silent simply by entering it and saying nothing. This was a complete reversal of how power usually looked in his world, and the show used that reversal on purpose. The criminals around Gus understood power as display. They wore it loudly, in gold and in threats and in sudden bursts of violence, because for them, being feared meant being seen to be feared. They shouted, they postured, they beat people in front of witnesses to prove they could. And every bit of that noise was a kind of weakness, because noise can be heard, and what can be heard can be tracked, and what can be tracked can be caught. The loud man announces himself to his enemies and to the law alike. He cannot hide, because hiding is the opposite of everything his power is built on. Gus saw all of this clearly, and he built himself as the answer to it. He understood that the truest power does not need to announce itself at all. The man who is genuinely in control has no need to perform control, and the performance, in fact, gives the game away. There is a confrontation early in his dealings with Walter White that lays this out almost like a lesson. The two men meet at a quiet table in the restaurant, and Walt, trying to flatter his way into a partnership, praises Gus for his discipline and his caution. Walt tells him that he sees the two of them as alike, both careful, both controlled, both men who think before they act. It is meant as a compliment, an attempt to find common ground, and Gus, in response, lets the polite mask drop for just a moment and shows Walt something colder underneath. He tells Walt plainly that Walt is not careful at all, that he shows poor judgment, pointing to the fact that Walt has brought his partner, Jesse, to the meeting visibly impaired by drugs. In a few sentences, Gus dismantles the flattery and exposes the gap between them. Walt likes to think of himself as a careful man, but Walt is ruled by ego and impatience and need, and Gus can see it. The real discipline in the room belongs to only one of them, and it is the one who said the least. That scene matters because it shows that Gus did not merely possess self-control. He recognized it as the dividing line between people, the single quality that separated those who would survive from those who would not. He valued caution and professionalism above almost everything else, and he chose the people around him accordingly, surrounding himself with those who could keep their heads and discarding those who could not. He admired the trait in others because he had built his whole survival on it in himself. To Gus, a man not control himself was a man who could not be trusted, because such a man would eventually, under pressure, do something foolish, and foolish things get people killed and operations exposed. The drug world is full of pressure. The only people who last in it, in his view, are the ones who can hold themselves perfectly steady when everything around them is shaking. And things around Gus shook constantly. This is the part that is easy to forget when remembering him as a figure of pure calm. He was not a man living an easy life who simply happened to be composed. He was a man under relentless, grinding pressure from every direction at once. And the composure was what he wore to carry it. He was running a legitimate restaurant chain that demanded real attention, managing employees, serving customers, keeping the books, maintaining the public face that all of it depended on. At the same time, he was running a vast and illegal operation that could collapse at any moment, hiding it. From law enforcement, from rivals, from the cartel he outwardly served and secretly schemed against. He was juggling more risk in a single day than most people face in a lifetime, and he did it while pausing to ask a customer whether they were enjoying their meal. The calm was not the absence of stress. The calm was a man holding an enormous weight and refusing to let his arms shake. The discipline went deeper than behavior in public. It shaped how he handled information, how he made decisions, how he related to the people who worked for him. He kept a careful distance from the product he sold, never letting himself be photographed near it, never handling it directly, building layers of separation between himself and the crime so that no single thread could be traced back to him. He planned ahead with a patience that bordered on the inhuman, content to let his business grow slowly rather than reaching for fast money that would draw fast attention. He thought several moves ahead of the people he dealt with, anticipating what his rivals would do and preparing his responses long before they were needed. He positioned himself so that powerful forces on both sides of the law came to see him as useful, even indispensable, so that the very people who might have destroyed him had reasons to keep him around. None of this is the work of a calm temperament. All of it is the work of a calculating mind that had trained calmness into a tool. There is a way of thinking about Gus that compares him less to a criminal and more to a chief executive, and the comparison fits him better than it has any right to. He built an operation that was efficient and scalable and disciplined. He minimized chaos because chaos was bad for business. He kept violence to a minimum, using it rarely, and only when it served a clear purpose, because pointless violence drew attention, and attention was the enemy. He even hired a trained chemist to manufacture his product with scientific precision, treating the work as a process to be optimized, rather than a hustle to be improvised. He thought in systems, in structures that could function smoothly and survive disruption. This is what made him so much more dangerous than the men who came before him. He was not simply a thug who had gotten lucky. He was an organizer, a builder, a manager of risk, and he brought to crime the same cold competence that might have made him a titan in any legitimate field. The terror of him was that he was effective, and his effectiveness flowed directly from his self-control. The contrast with Walter White runs underneath this whole part of the story and gives it its shape. Walt is a man who imagines himself to be cold and rational, a chemist who thinks in logic and process, and for a time he can perform that role convincingly. But Walt is ruled by feeling in a way Gus never is. He is proud, and his pride makes him reckless. He is resentful, and his resentment pushes him into fights he does not need. He wants to be seen, to be acknowledged, to have his genius recognized, and that hunger leads him again and again into danger. His eyes dart, his temper flares. He makes decisions in the heat of wounded ego and then has to scramble to survive their consequences. Gus, standing across from this man, represented everything Walt wanted to be and could not manage to become. A man who felt things, surely, but who had buried those feelings so deep and walled them off so completely that they never once reached his hands or his face or his voice. Walt admired Gus. Walt feared Gus. And on some level, Walt understood that Gus had achieved a mastery of himself that Walt, for all his intelligence, would never possess. It would be a mistake, though, to leave the impression that this stillness was a healthy thing, or that it represented some kind of inner peace. The composure of Gus Fring was not the calm of a man at rest. It was the calm of a man holding something terrible perfectly still. The way a person carries a full glass across a crowded room without spilling a drop. Underneath the steady surface, there was grief he never released, rage he never expressed, a need for revenge so old and so deep that it had become the quiet organizing principle of his entire existence. The discipline was, in part, the only way he could function while carrying all of that. If he had ever let the feeling show, even once, the whole carefully built life might have come apart. So he held it in, every day, for years, and the holding became who he was. The stillness was a weapon pointed outward at his enemies, and it was also a cage he had built around himself, and he lived inside both at once. This is the strange and human thing about his self-control, and it is why it is worth examining so carefully before going any further. The same quality that made Gus magnificent also made him lonely and rigid and ultimately vulnerable in a way he could not see. A man who never lets his guard down has no one he can truly be himself with, because being himself is the one thing his survival forbids. A man who has trained himself never to act on feeling becomes a man who cannot easily change course when feeling demands it. The wall that kept his enemies out also kept everyone else out, and kept him locked inside with the old wound he was trying so hard to control. For most of his story, this looks like pure strength. Only at the very end does it reveal its cost. When the one moment he allows himself a flush of feeling, a moment of pride he could not quite contain, becomes the crack through which everything pours out. But that comes later. For now, in the steady middle of his reign, the stillness is simply the most impressive thing about him, the quality that announces, every time he enters a scene, that the most dangerous person in the room is also the quietest. He frightened people who frightened everyone else. He commanded respect from men who respected nothing. He did it without ever raising his voice, without ever losing his temper, without ever showing his hand. The discipline was total, and the totality of it was the point. A man who controls himself that completely creates the impression that he can control anything. And in the world of the show, that impression was worth more than any army. The self-control, though, was only the surface of his beliefs, the visible shape of something deeper. A man does not build a wall like that around himself for no reason. There has to be a story he tells himself about why the discipline matters, a code that gives the endless restraint a meaning and a purpose. Gus had such a code, and on one rare occasion he spoke it aloud, sitting across a table from Walter White, and explaining in his slow and deliberate way what he believed a man was actually for. It was a speech about duty, about provision, about bearing up under a weight without thanks or recognition, and it would burrow into Walt and shape the lie he told himself for the rest of his life. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. We have looked closely at the stillness that was the foundation of everything Gus built, the self-control he trained into a weapon and wore as armor against a world of louder, weaker men. Next, we turn to the words he used to explain himself, the quiet speech about what a man owes. That code of duty would take root in Walter White and grow into something far darker than Gus ever said aloud. Section 3. A man provides. There is a quiet scene, set in the back of the restaurant, where Gus Fring explains himself more openly than he does almost anywhere else in the whole story. Walter White has come to him in a moment of doubt. Walt has been frightened by the violence of the world he has entered, shaken by how close it has come to his family, and he is wavering, unsure whether he can continue. He sits across from Gus looking for a reason to walk away. And Gus, instead of threatening him or pressuring him, gives him something stranger and more powerful. He gives him a philosophy. He asks Walt what a man does, and then he answers his own question. A man provides for his family, Gus says, and he does it even when he is not appreciated or respected or even loved. He simply bears up, and he does it because he is a man. It is one of the most quoted moments in the entire series, and it is the closest Gus ever comes to handing the audience the code he lives by, the story he tells himself about why his life of endless discipline and risk is worth living. On the surface, it is a noble-sounding thing to say. It speaks of duty, of responsibility, of the willingness to carry a burden without reward. It frames a man as someone defined by what he does for others, by the weight he bears, so that the people who depend on him can be safe. There is something almost tender in it, something that sounds like wisdom passed down from one father to another. And that is exactly why it works on Walt so completely. Walt is a man drowning in the feeling that he has failed his family, that he will leave them with nothing, that his life has been a long disappointment. Gus offers him a different story to tell himself, a story in which everything he is doing, every terrible thing, becomes an act of quiet heroism. A man provides, a man bears up, a man does what must be done and asks for no thanks. Walt hears this, and something in him settles, because it gives a shape and a dignity to the choices he has already made and the worse ones he is about to make. The genius of the moment, and the darkness underneath it, is that Gus is not simply offering comfort. He is recruiting. Walt is the most gifted chemist Gus has ever found, the source of a product purer than anything his operation has produced. And Gus needs him to keep working. The speech about provision is, among other things, a tool. It is aimed precisely at the wound Walt carries, the fear of being a failure as a man and a father, and it presses on that wound in a way designed to keep Walt loyal and productive. Gus has taken the measure of this man, seen exactly what drives him, and crafted a philosophy that will keep him cooking. The words are sincere enough that they land, and calculated enough that they serve a purpose. And the ability to be both at once is one of the things that made Gus so dangerous. He could tell a true thing and use it as a weapon in the same breath. But the speech is more than a manipulation, and this is what makes it worth slowing down on. It is also, almost certainly, a window into how Gus genuinely understood himself. Because Gus, too, was a man who provided. His entire life of discipline and concealment and patient labor was organized around obligations he had taken on, debts he felt he owed, a responsibility he had decided to carry no matter the cost to himself. He bore up. He did the work, even when no one appreciated it, even when no one knew the truth of what he was doing, even when there was no recognition or love to be found anywhere in it. The code he handed Walt was the code he had been living by for decades, and when he spoke it aloud, he was describing his own existence as much as he was shaping Walt's. The provision Gus had in mind was not the simple provision of money for a household. It was something larger and stranger, an obligation to a memory, a duty owed to someone long dead, a promise he had made in his heart and refused to break. The idea of family ran all through the way Gus presented himself, and he returned to it more than once. He spoke to Walt about how children make a man's path clear, how they become his priority and his responsibility, how a father's duty organizes everything else. He framed the whole burden of a man's life around the people he is bound to protect. It was a vision of masculinity, built on sacrifice and endurance, on the quiet swallowing of one's own needs for the sake of others. And it sounded, coming from him, completely sincere, because Gus carried himself like a man who had given up his own happiness in service of something he would not name. The respectable businessman, the generous donor, the careful provider, all of it was wrapped in this language of duty, and the language was believable because some part of it was true. The trouble, and the reason this code is so worth examining, is that the noble words sat directly on top of something monstrous. The same man who spoke so movingly about provision and responsibility was a cold-blooded killer who had ended lives with his own hands and ordered the ending of many more. The same philosophy that framed him as a man bearing a heavy burden also served to justify, in his own mind, a campaign of violence and deception that ruined countless lives. The code of duty was real, and it was also a cover, a way of dressing up appetite and vengeance in the clothing of honor. This is the thing the show understood about him, and about the kind of self-justification that powerful and dangerous men reach for. The story you tell yourself about why you do terrible things does not have to be false to be corrupt. It can be sincere and still be a lie, sincere in the feeling and false in the conclusion, true enough to believe and twisted enough to excuse anything. Walt absorbed all of this, and it became the foundation of his own great lie. Long before he met Gus, Walt had told himself that everything he did was for his family, that the cooking and the killing and the lying were all in service of providing for the people he would leave behind. Gus did not invent this story for Walt, but he gave it a shape and a dignity it had not quite had before. He turned a desperate excuse into a philosophy, a frightened man's rationalization into a code a man could be proud of. After that conversation, Walt had language for what he was doing. He was not a criminal chasing money and power. He was a man providing for his family, bearing up under a weight, doing what a man does. The phrase became part of the scaffolding that held Walt's self-image together, and it held for a long time, right up until the very end of his story, when he finally admitted that the family had never really been the reason at all. And here, the two men reveal themselves to be both alike and completely different, and the comparison is worth drawing out. Both lived by a code of provision. Both told themselves that their crimes were acts of duty, performed for the people they loved, but the codes pointed in opposite directions underneath. Walt's talk of family was, in the end, a lie he told to hide a hunger for power and recognition, a mask over an ego that wanted to matter. When the mask finally came off, what stood revealed was a man who had done it all for himself because it made him feel alive. Gus was harder to read because his mask never came off in the same way, but the shape of his code was different. His provision was aimed backward, at a loss in his past, at a promise he had made to someone who was gone. Walt's family excuse was a way of avoiding the truth about his desires. Gus's duty was a way of organizing his entire life around a grief he could not let go of. One man used the language of provision to hide from himself. The other used it to keep faith with a ghost. There is another line Gus offers that opens a different window onto his thinking, a remark about wealth that reveals how completely he had reorganized his sense of what a life is for. He tells Walt in his measured way that Walt is a wealthy man now, and that one must learn how to be rich, because anyone can manage being poor. It is a strange and revealing thing to say. It treats wealth not as a comfort or a reward, but as a discipline, a state that demands its own kind of mastery, a responsibility that most people are not equipped to handle. To Gus, money was not the point and never had been. He had more of it than he could spend, and it had bought him none of the things a person actually wants. The wealth was a tool, a means to an end, a resource to be managed in service of the larger purpose that drove him. A poor man, in this view, has only the simple problem of survival. A rich man has the harder problem of what to do with power, and Gus had given that problem decades of thought. This is the heart of his code, and the thing that separates him from almost every other criminal in his world. For the men around him, the work was about appetite. They wanted money, and what money buys, and the status that comes with it. They were in it for themselves, in the most direct way. Gus was something colder and more disciplined. The empire was never really about enjoying its fruits. He lived modestly. He took no obvious pleasure in luxury. The fortune piled up, and he kept working, kept building, kept enduring, because the wealth and the power were only instruments of a purpose that had nothing to do with comfort. He had learned how to be rich in exactly the way he described to Walt. He had mastered the discipline of holding enormous power without being softened or distracted by it, of keeping his eyes on a distant goal while everyone around him grabbed for the nearest pleasure. The code of provision and the discipline of wealth were two faces of the same belief, that a man is defined by the burden he carries and the purpose he serves, and that the carrying and the serving matter more than any reward. It is a philosophy that can sound almost admirable when stated plainly, and that is precisely its danger. Duty, responsibility, endurance, the willingness to bear a weight without thanks. These are real virtues, things that genuinely good people build their lives around. Gus took those virtues and bent them to serve something dark, and the bending was so subtle that the words never lost their dignity. He could speak the language of honor while doing the work of a killer. And the language did not crack because he had wrapped his cruelty so completely inside his sense of duty that even he may not have been able to tell where one ended and the other began. This is how a man like Gus survives inside his own mind. The story is too good to question. The code is too noble to doubt. And so, the violence continues, year after year, dressed in the clothing of a father providing for his family, while the real purpose underneath stays hidden even from the man serving it. That hidden purpose, the thing all the duty and discipline and provision were actually in service of, is the engine of his whole story, and it had nothing to do with money or family in any ordinary sense. To understand what Gus was really providing for, and to whom, requires going back further than the restaurant, further than the empire, all the way to the thing that set the entire machine in motion. But before that, there is the matter of how he carried his purpose across the years. The sheer inhuman patience of him, the willingness to wait and wait and wait for an outcome that might take a lifetime to arrive. He told a story once, to an enemy who could not hear him, about a tree and a small animal. And that story reveals more about how Gus thought about time and waiting, and finishing what he started than almost anything else he ever said. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. We have unpacked the code Gus spoke aloud, the philosophy of duty and provision that he handed to Walter White and lived by himself, noble in its words and dark in its purpose. Next, we look at the patience that let him serve that purpose across decades. A strange childhood story about a tree and a hunted animal will show exactly how Gus thought about waiting and about never letting go. Section 4. The long game. If there is a single quality that separates Gus Fring from every other figure in his world, deeper even than his self-control, it is his relationship with time. Most people and almost all criminals live in the near future. They want the next score, the next win, the next pleasure, and they reach for it as soon as it comes within grasp. Patience, for them, is a burden to be endured on the way to getting what they want. For Gus, patience was something else entirely. It was a faith. He believed, all the way down, that the man who can wait will always defeat the man who cannot. That time itself is a weapon if you have the discipline to wield it, and that almost anything can be achieved by someone willing to move slowly, enough and long enough toward a single fixed point. He built his empire on this belief, letting his business grow at a careful, unhurried pace while flashier rivals burned themselves out. And he aimed this same patience at the great purpose of his life, a revenge so long in the making that it stretched across decades, a weight so total that it organized everything he did. There is a scene, late in the prequel series that explores his earlier years, that opens a rare window onto where this patience came from and what it cost him. His old enemy, Hector Salamanca, lies in a hospital bed, unconscious, recovering from a stroke that Gus has quietly arranged to interrupt. Gus has dismissed Hector's doctor and stopped the treatment that might have helped him, because Gus does not want Hector to die. At least not yet, not like this. He wants something far more particular than death, and so he sits beside the bed of a man who cannot hear him and tells him a story from his own childhood, a story he has, perhaps never told anyone, delivered in a slow and steady voice to a listener who cannot respond. It is one of the most revealing moments the character was ever given, a 5-minute monologue that pulls back the curtain on the boy that the man used to be. The story is about a tree. As a poor child in Chile, Gus says, he tended a lucuma tree, a fruit tree that he nursed and watered and brought back to health with his own patient care. The tree in time bore fruit, and the fruit fed and earned him a small living. It was his, the product of his attention and his labor, a thing he had created out of nothing through persistence. And then, one day a coati came, a small animal about the size of a house cat, and it ransacked the tree and ate most of the fruit, destroying in a few greedy minutes the thing the boy had spent so long building. Gus described setting a trap for the animal. The trap caught it, but the coati thrashed so violently that it broke free, breaking its own leg in the struggle, and it slipped away and hid beneath the shack where Gus and his siblings lived. And then comes the part of the story that tells you everything about the man. Gus waited. He sat outside through the hours of the night, watching, motionless, expecting the animal to emerge. And when at last it did, hobbled and wounded and slow, he caught it. The merciful thing, he says, would have been to kill it quickly. He did not do the merciful thing. He kept it alive, and he drew out its suffering. Sitting beside Hector's bed, Gus makes the comparison plain. Hector is the coati, the animal that took what was his, that destroyed the thing he had built and loved, will not be granted a quick end. It will be kept alive and made to suffer on Gus's schedule and according to Gus's will. The whole monologue is a threat delivered to a man who cannot hear it, a quiet promise of a slow revenge. But it is also, as the actor who played him has noted, something more than a threat. It is Gus speaking to himself, giving voice to who he is, weaving a story about his own past that reveals how hard and how long he worked to climb out of poverty, and how deeply it cut him when someone took away the person he had loved. The animal in the story stands in for Hector. Yes, but the patience in the story is the truest thing in it. The boy who could sit motionless through an entire night, waiting for a wounded animal to show itself, became the man who could wait decades to destroy the people who had wronged him. It should be said plainly that the literal truth of this childhood story is uncertain, and the show seems to want it that way. The coati is an animal of the wrong region, not native to the part of the world Gus describes, and careful viewers have wondered whether the tale is a real memory or an invention, a parable Gus built to frighten Hector or to comfort himself. The actor has said he understood it as true, and the writing treats it as a window into the man. But Gus is a notoriously unreliable narrator of his own past, and the blurriness is almost certainly deliberate. Whether or not a coati ever ravaged a real tree in a real Chilean childhood, the story is true in the way that matters. It tells you how Gus thinks about time, about loss, about waiting, and about the difference between killing a thing and making it pay. The facts may be uncertain. The philosophy inside the story is not. That philosophy showed itself most clearly in how Gus handled his greatest enemy. Hector Salamanca was the man who had carried out the killing that broke Gus's heart and set his whole life of revenge in motion. Gus wanted him dead, and yet, when fate handed Gus a chance to let Hector simply die, when a stroke left the old man hovering near the end, Gus refused to allow it. He intervened to keep Hector alive, and then he arranged for that life to be a kind of living death. The man confined to a wheelchair, robbed of his speech, trapped inside a ruined body, with a clear and burning mind. This was not mercy, and it was not restraint. It was the long game made flesh. A quick death would have ended Hector's suffering, and ending the suffering was the last thing Gus wanted. He wanted Hector to live, helpless and silent, for years, knowing what had happened to him, and unable to do anything about it. He wanted the coati kept alive under the house, its leg broken, waiting, and he was willing to wait a long sit for as long as it took. The patience this required is almost difficult to comprehend. To hate a man that deeply, to carry a wound that raw, and yet to deny yourself the satisfaction of ending him, to instead keep him alive specifically so that the revenge can be slower and more complete, requires a control over one's own impulses that borders on the inhuman. Most people, given the chance to destroy the person who hurt them most, would take it in a heartbeat. The hunger for it would be overwhelming. Gus took that hunger and harnessed it, turned it into fuel for a campaign that would unfold over years, refusing every easy and immediate satisfaction in favor of a final reckoning that he could shape exactly to his liking. The patience was not the absence of rage. The patience was rage placed under perfect discipline and pointed at a target far in the future. This same quality ran through his approach to building his empire. He did not rush. He let his operation grow, slowly, quietly, organically, the way a careful gardener lets a tree mature rather than forcing it. He spent years constructing the infrastructure that would eventually free him. From the cartel he outwardly served, a hidden laboratory built in secret beneath an industrial laundry, a distribution system disguised inside a legitimate supply chain. All of it assembled piece by patient piece, while he maintained the appearance of loyal and unambitious associate. He was content to appear smaller than he was, weaker than he was, less ambitious than he was, because appearing so served the long plan. The men around him wanted to be seen as powerful immediately. Gus was willing to be underestimated for years if being underestimated brought his goal closer. He understood that the slow accumulation of advantage, invisible to one's enemies, is far more powerful than any sudden display, and that the patient man can prepare a trap so gradually that no one notices it being built until it has already closed. There is a deep connection between this patience and the discipline examined earlier, and the two reinforce each other. A man who cannot control himself cannot wait, because the waiting itself is a form of self-control, a constant refusal of the immediate in favor of the eventual. Every day that Gus did not act on his hatred of Hector, every day that he served chicken and shook hands and played the modest businessman while his real purpose moved forward in secret, was a day of discipline, a small victory of will over impulse. The stillness and the patience were the same muscle, exercised over and over until it became the defining strength of the man. He could hold himself motionless in a room full of enemies, and he could hold himself motionless across years of waiting for revenge. And both came from the same place, the same refusal to let feeling dictate action, the same faith that the man who waits will win. And yet, like everything about Gus, this great strength carried a hidden cost, and the cost was a kind of imprisonment. A man who organizes his entire life around a distant goal becomes a prisoner of that goal, unable to rest, unable to enjoy what he has built, unable to imagine a life beyond the purpose that drives him. Gus had more money than he could ever use, and no peace at all, because the long game was never finished, because there was always one more move to make, one more enemy to outlast, one more step toward a reckoning that consumed everything else. The patience that made him powerful also made him unable to stop. He had been waiting so long and built so much of himself around the waiting that the wait had become his whole existence. There was no version of Gus that simply walked away, satisfied, took his fortune, and lived. The revenge was not something he wanted to complete and move past. It was the thing that held him together, and a man held together by a single distant purpose has nowhere to go once that purpose is either achieved or lost. This is the strange tragedy buried inside his patience. The wait was magnificent, a feat of discipline almost no one else could match, and it was also a cage with no door. The childhood story he told to the unconscious Hector reveals it perfectly. The boy who waited all night for the wounded animal was all ready. Even then, a person who would rather prolong a thing than finish it, who found meaning in the slow drawing out of an outcome, rather than in any peace that might come after. That boy grew into a man who would spend decades on a single revenge, and who would, in the end, be undone partly by his own unwillingness to simply let his enemy die. The patience that was his greatest weapon kept him chained to the very people he hated, and the chain held him in place long enough for his own carefully built world to be turned against him. To see how that wait began and what it was a wait for requires going back to the loss that started everything, the death that lit the fuse and set the long game in motion. But the patience and the revenge could only function because of something else Gus had built with equal care, the elaborate machine of concealment that let him operate in the open for all those years without ever being caught. The restaurants, the donations, the careful distance from the product, the whole architecture of hiding in the light. That machine is what kept the long game alive, and it is worth examining on its own. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. We have followed the patience of Gus Fring back to a childhood story about a wounded animal and a long night's wait, and seen how that same patience kept an enemy alive for years so the revenge could be slow and complete. Next, we look at the machine that made it all possible, the elaborate disguise of restaurants and donations and distance. Hiding an empire in plain sight took a structure as disciplined as the man himself. Section 5. Hiding the empire. A man can be disciplined, patient, and driven by a clear purpose, and still be caught if he has no way to hide what he does. Self-control keeps the hands steady. Patience keeps the goal in view. But neither one, on its own, keeps a criminal out of prison. For that, Gus needed something more, and he built it with the same care he brought to everything else. He built a machine of concealment so complete that for years the most powerful drug distributor in the southwest of the country walked through his own city as a beloved and trusted citizen, dined with the agents hunting him, and never once came under serious suspicion. The empire was real, vast, and dangerous. The disguise around it was a work of art, and understanding how it was built is essential to understanding the philosophy of the man who built it. The center of the disguise was the chain of fast food restaurants, Los Pollos Hermanos, the Chicken Brothers. On the surface, it was a legitimate and successful business, popular with families, clean and bright and entirely ordinary. People ate there, people worked there. The books balanced, and underneath that ordinary surface, the restaurant served a second function, moving product and laundering money through a network so well disguised that the legitimate business and the criminal one flowed through the same channels without anyone noticing the difference. The trucks that carried chicken supplies carried other things. The cash that flowed through the registers mixed with cash that had no honest origin. The restaurant was both exactly what it appeared to be and something else entirely, and the two identities were braided together so tightly that pulling them apart was nearly impossible. A drug operation hidden behind a chicken stand sounds almost like a joke, and that was precisely the strength of it. No one looks for an empire behind a fast food counter. Beneath the disguise of the restaurant sat a second and deeper layer of concealment, an industrial laundry that Gus also owned, a facility that washed linens for hospitals and hotels across the region. The laundry was a legitimate business too, loud and hot and full of machinery, the kind of place no one thinks twice about. And buried underneath it, accessible through a hidden entrance, lay the true heart of the operation, a state-of-the-art laboratory built in secret, where Gus's product was manufactured in quantities and at a purity that no street operation could match. The laboratory was the engine of his independence, the thing that would eventually free him from the cartel he outwardly served. And he had hidden it under the most boring possible cover, layers deep, beneath a working laundry, beneath an unremarkable industrial lot. To find it, a person would have to know it was there, and almost no one did. The structure of the concealment mirrored the structure of the man. Calm surface, hidden depths, the most important thing buried furthest from view. The most audacious part of the disguise was not the restaurants or the laundry, though it was the way Gus turned the law itself into part of his cover. He did not merely avoid the Drug Enforcement Administration. He befriended it. He made large donations to its local office. He attended its events. He shook hands with its agents and let himself be photographed beside them, a generous member of the community supporting the brave men and women fighting the drug trade. It was an almost unbelievable move, the largest drug distributor in the area positioning himself as a public ally of the agency tasked with destroying him. And it worked because it was so far beyond what anyone would expect that it never occurred to them to question it. The guilty man hides from the police. Gus understood that hiding from the police is what makes a man look guilty, and so he did the opposite. He stood beside them, smiling, and let his open friendship with the law become the strongest proof of his innocence. This is where the phrase he used to describe himself becomes more than a clever line. He told Walt that he hid in plain sight, and the whole architecture of his empire was the practice of that single idea. The instinct of almost every criminal is to retreat, to conceal, to build walls and stay in the shadows. Gus saw the flaw in that instinct. Shadows draw the eye. A man who is never seen becomes a man people wonder about, and wondering leads to looking, and looking leads to finding. So Gus refused the shadows entirely. He made himself maximally visible, maximally accounted for, maximally ordinary, a fixture of public life, with a clear and respectable explanation for everything he did and everywhere he went. The visibility was the disguise. A man who is always in the light, doing good and known to everyone, is the last man anyone thinks to search. Gus had inverted the logic of hiding, and the inversion protected him for years. The discipline this required, day after day, is staggering to consider. Maintaining a single identity is effortless, because it is simply who a person is. Maintaining two complete and opposite identities at the same time, holding both of them steady, never letting one bleed into the other, never slipping, never letting the mask drop in front of the wrong person, is a labor that never ends. Every interaction had to be managed. Every public appearance was a performance. The friendly restaurant manager and the cold kingpin had to be kept in separate sealed rooms inside the same man, and the doors between those rooms could never be allowed to open at the wrong moment. Gus did this for years, without visible strain, because the same self-control that let him sit motionless in a room full of enemies let him hold two selves apart inside one body. The concealment was not just a set of businesses and donations. It was a constant act of will, a discipline of identity as demanding as anything else he did. The reach of the machine extended beyond his own city too, in ways that hint at how carefully it had all been assembled. His operation was backed in part by a large foreign conglomerate, a respectable corporation that gave his enterprise a layer of legitimate cover stretching across borders. That connection came through an old associate from his earlier life, a man he had known back in the years before he ever arrived in the country, and the relationship suggests that the architecture of concealment had roots reaching far back into a past Gus kept hidden. He had been building cover, building distance, building the appearance of legitimacy for longer than anyone around him understood. The chicken restaurants were only the visible part of a structure whose foundations had been laid years and continents away by a man who had perhaps always known that he would need to hide something enormous one day. There was also a careful distance he kept from the product itself, a discipline of separation that protected him as surely as any disguise. He almost never touched the drugs. He almost never stood near them. He built layer upon layer of people and process between himself and the actual crime, so that no single thread could ever be pulled to connect him directly to it. He let others handle the dangerous parts, the cookings and the transporting and the selling, while he remained clean, distant, deniable. When he needed a chemist to replace Walt, he found one and groomed him quietly, keeping his own hands far from the work. This obsessive distance was part of why he was so hard to catch. There was simply nothing to find that pointed at him. No moment where the respectable businessman could be placed alongside the product he secretly controlled. He had engineered himself out of the evidence, made himself almost invisible inside his own operation, present everywhere and traceable nowhere. It is worth pausing on the strangeness of a life lived this way, because the philosophy of concealment came with a price that Gus paid every single day. To hide so completely is to be, in a sense, profoundly alone. No one in his public life knew the truth of him. No one in his criminal life knew the whole of him either. He had divided himself so thoroughly that there was perhaps no single person on earth who saw all of who he was. The mask that protected him also isolated him, sealed him off, ensured that every relationship he had was partial, built on a version of himself he was performing, rather than the man underneath. The concealment kept him safe and kept him unknown, and the two were the same thing. A man who hides in plain sight is seen by everyone and known by no one. And Gus lived inside that contradiction for years, present at every community event and genuinely alone in a way few people ever are. He did leave one small mark that hints at what the hiding cost him. One place where the private man briefly showed through the public disguise. Years before the events of the main story, he quietly established a chemistry scholarship at a local university, funding the education of young people in a field that had meant a great deal to someone he had lost. The scholarship was given in the name of that lost person, a small and lasting tribute hidden inside the respectable philanthropy of a successful businessman. To the public, it looked like more of the same, another generous gesture from a civic-minded donor. Underneath, it was something tender and grief-stricken, a memorial to a love he could never speak of openly, woven into the fabric of his public disguise, so that he could honor it without anyone understanding what they were looking at. Even his concealment had concealment inside it. Even his disguise carried, hidden in its folds, a quiet act of devotion to the thing that drove him. That detail is the thread that connects the architecture of hiding to the engine underneath it all. Because the whole vast machine, the restaurants, and the laundry, and the laboratory, and the donations, and the corporate backing, and the careful distance from the product, all of it existed to serve a purpose that had nothing to do with money or comfort, or even power for its own sake. The empire was a means. The concealment protected the means. And the end, the thing it was all secretly for, traced back to a single death long ago, a loss that Gus had never released and never would. To understand why a man would build all of this and live this hidden, divided, lonely life requires going back to the beginning, to the wound that started everything. But the empire also had to be controlled from the inside, held in line, kept disciplined, and Gus had a particular and chilling way of doing that. He used fear, precisely and coldly, as a kind of language, and the clearest example of it is one of the most shocking moments in the entire story. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. We have walked through the machine of concealment Gus built, the restaurants, and the laundry and the hidden lab, the donations to the very agency hunting him, the whole art of hiding an empire in the open. Next, we look at how he held that empire in line from within. Gus controlled the people around him through fear, and the way he delivered it was as cold and precise as everything else about him. Section 6. Control through fear. Every empire runs on something, some force that keeps the people inside it doing what they are told. For some leaders, it is loyalty, earned through care and reward. For others, it is money, the simple promise of payment. Gus Fring used something colder and more reliable than either. He used fear. But the fear he used was unlike the fear that ruled the other criminals in his world, and the difference reveals one of the deepest parts of his philosophy. The men around him frightened people through rage, through unpredictability, through sudden explosions of violence that could come at any moment. for any reason. Their fear was the fear of chaos, of a leader who might turn on anyone at any time. Gus rejected all of that. His fear was the fear of order, of consequences perfectly understood, of a man who would do exactly what he said he would do, and never one thing more. He frightened people, not by being wild, but by being certain. And the certainty was far more terrifying than any tantrum could ever be. The clearest demonstration of this philosophy, and one of the most shocking moments in the entire series, comes at the start of the 4th season, in an episode built around a single act of violence, so precise and so cold that it has stayed with viewers ever since. The situation leading up to it was tense and dangerous. Gus's chemist, the man he had groomed to replace Walt, had been murdered, shot by Walt's partner Jesse in a desperate bid to keep Walt alive and useful. The killing had been messy. Gus's enforcer, a loyal man named Victor, had rushed to the scene too late to stop it, and in doing so had been seen by neighbors, had left evidence behind, had exposed himself in a way that put the entire operation at risk. Worse, Victor had then tried to prove his own value by cooking a batch of product himself, attempting to show that he had learned the process by watching Walt work. He had overstepped and he had been careless, and both of those things mattered enormously to a man like Gus. The scene unfolds in the laboratory. Walt and Jesse are being held, certain that they are about to die, because they have killed Gus's chemist and broken his rules and put everything in danger. Gus arrives in silence. He does not shout. He does not deliver a speech. He calmly removes his fine clothes and puts on a set of work coveralls, methodical and unhurried, while everyone in the room waits in dread to see what he will do. The whole scene is constructed so that the audience, like Walt and Jesse, expects Gus to kill one or both of them, to punish the men responsible for the disaster. And then Gus does something no one expects. He picks up a box cutter, a simple utility knife, and without a word he draws it across the throat of Victor, his own loyal enforcer, the man who had served him faithfully for years. He kills not the men who broke his rules, but the man who had exposed the operation, and he does it in front of everyone, in total silence, and then he sets the tool down, looks at the stunned survivors, and tells them to get back to work. The power of the moment lies entirely in its restraint, and that restraint is the philosophy made visible. There is no anger in it. There is no pleasure in it. There is no speech explaining it. Gus does the thing and then returns immediately to business, as though the killing were simply one more task that needed doing. A problem solved and now behind him. The message to Walt and Jesse is delivered without a single threat being spoken aloud. If a loyal man who served him for years could be killed this casually for endangering the operation, then no one is safe. And the two of them, who had endangered it far more, are alive only because Gus has decided they are more useful breathing than dead. The lesson is unmistakable, and it does not need words. Gus values the operation above loyalty, above service, above sentiment of any kind, and he will protect it with a coldness that no amount of past faithfulness can soften. Fear, delivered this way, is total, because it cannot be predicted away or earned away. There is no behavior that guarantees safety except perfect usefulness and perfect discipline. It is worth understanding why Victor specifically, because the logic of it is the logic of the whole man. Victor's crime was not disloyalty. He had been completely loyal. His crime was exposure. He had been seen at the scene of the murder, had left evidence, had made himself a thread that could be pulled, a weakness in the wall that protected everything Gus had built. To Gus, that was the unforgivable thing. far worse than any failure of obedience. The entire empire depended on concealment, on the careful distance between Gus and the crime, and Victor had punctured that concealment through carelessness. By killing him, Gus removed the weakness and sent his message in a single stroke. The man who threatened the operation's secrecy was eliminated, and everyone who remained understood, in their bones, exactly what the highest law was. Protect the operation. Stay invisible. Make no mistakes. The fear Gus created was precisely targeted at the behavior he most needed from his people, and that precision is what made it a tool rather than a mere cruelty. There is a detail about how the scene was made that deepens what it reveals. The actor who played Gus has spoken about how he approached it, and he was determined not to play it as a basic act of violence, not to make it loud or theatrical. He chose silence. He concentrated so hard on finding the right cold stillness that he barely spoke to anyone on set during the filming. Holding himself in the character's frozen focus, he has said he was concerned about performing the act without damaging his own spirit, without letting the darkness of it touch something real in him. The result of that care is a scene where the horror comes entirely from the calm, from the absence of feeling, from a man committing a brutal killing with the same composure he would bring to wiping down a table. The choice to do less, to strip away every bit of rage and spectacle, is what made the moment unforgettable. It was reportedly so disturbing that the daughter of the actor playing Walt fainted while watching it. And all of that impact came from restraint, from a violence so controlled that it felt less like an outburst and more like a verdict. This is the heart of how Gus understood fear, and it connects directly to everything else about him. His violence was never a loss of control. It was the opposite, an expression of total control, a demonstration that he could end a life as calmly as he could, conduct any other piece of business. The cartel men he despised used violence emotionally, in anger, in pride, in the heat of the moment, and their violence was a kind of weakness, a sign that their feelings had taken the wheel. Gus's violence was always cold, always purposeful, always a message rather than a release. He killed when killing served a function, and he killed in exactly the way that would send the clearest signal. And then he stopped immediately, the moment the function was served. There was no excess, no wasted cruelty for its own sake in these moments. Only the precise application of fear, where fear would do the most work. Violence to Gus was a language, and he spoke it with terrible fluency, and not a word more than necessary. The efficiency of this approach was real, and it is part of why his operation ran so smoothly for so long. People who are ruled by a wild and unpredictable leader live in constant low grade panic, and panic makes for poor work and bad decisions. People who are ruled by a leader whose rules are clear and whose consequences are certain know exactly where they stand, and that clarity paradoxically produces a kind of stability. Gus's people understood the law. Protect the operation. Stay disciplined. Do not expose anyone. Follow those rules and you would likely be safe and well paid. Break them, especially in the way that threatened the whole, and the consequence would be swift, certain, and without appeal. This was a more efficient form of control than rage could ever be, because it was consistent. And consistency lets people function. The fear was always present, but it was a structured fear, a fear with rules. And within those rules, the operation could run like the disciplined machine Gus needed it to be. And yet, as with every strength Gus possessed, this one carried a cost buried inside it, and the cost was a deep and permanent isolation. A man who kills his own loyal servants to send a message teaches everyone around him a brutal lesson, And the lesson is that loyalty to Gus buys nothing. Victor had served faithfully and died for a mistake. Anyone watching, including the hardened fixer Mike who witnessed the killing, learned that faithful service was no protection, that being useful was the only currency, and that the moment one stopped being useful or started being a risk, no history of loyalty would save them. This is a powerful way to control people through fear. It is a terrible way to build genuine loyalty or love or trust. Gus surrounded himself with people who feared him and obeyed him, and he had almost no one who was truly bound to him by anything warmer than self, interest, and dread. He had traded connection for control, and the trade left him alone at the center of his own empire, commanding everyone and trusted by no one, feared by all and close to none. This isolation was not an accident or a failure. It flowed directly from the philosophy. Fear and intimacy cannot easily share the same space. A leader who rules through terror cannot also be a man his people open up to, because the same coldness that keeps them in line keeps them at a distance. Gus had chosen long ago that control mattered more than companionship, that an obedient and frightened organization was worth more than a loving and loyal one. And for the purposes of running a drug empire, he was probably right. But a man is more than the empire he runs, and the choice that made his operation strong made his inner life a desert. The fear that protected him also walled him in, the same way the concealment did, the same way that discipline did. Everything that made Gus powerful pointed inward at the same lonely conclusion. He was a man who had given up nearly every human comfort in service of control and purpose, and the giving up was so complete that there was almost nothing left of him that was not strategy. The strategy and the fear and the control all served the purpose underneath, and that purpose is the thing that remains to be examined directly, because it explains why a man would accept such a life. Gus did not endure all of this isolation, did not build all of this concealment, did not rule through all of this fear for money or for the pleasures of power. He did it for a reason that reached back decades, to a single moment of loss that had set the entire machine in motion and never once let it rest. To understand the philosophy of Gus Fring fully, the discipline and the patience and the hiding and the fear must finally be traced back to their source, to the grief that powered all of it, and to the revenge that grief became. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. We have seen how Gus ruled his empire through a cold and precise fear, a violence used as language rather than rage. And we have seen the loneliness that kind of control left behind. Next, we reach the engine underneath everything, the loss that started it all. Every disciplined, patient, hidden, fearful thing about Gus was powered by a single old wound he would never let heal. Section 7. The engine of revenge underneath the stillness, beneath the patience, behind the disguise and the fear. There was a single thing that powered all of it, and it was not ambition, and it was not greed. It was grief. Everything Gus Fring became, every cold and disciplined quality that made him so formidable, was built on top of one old wound that he carried for decades and never allowed to close. The man who seemed to feel nothing was, at his core, a man organized entirely around a feeling, a loss so profound that it had quietly shaped the whole of his life. To understand him fully, the calm exterior has to be peeled back one last time, all the way down to the beginning, to a sunlit poolside in another country, where a man knelt over the body of someone he loved and made a silent promise that would take the rest of his life to keep. The person Gus loved was named Max Arciniega. The story of how they came together is told in fragments across the two series, but the shape of it is clear, and it is tender in a way that nothing else about Gus ever is. Max had grown up poor in the slums of a city far away, and Gus, by all accounts, lifted him out of that poverty. Gus paid for Max's education, sent him to university to study chemistry, invested in him and believed in him, and built a future alongside him. Together, the two of them founded the restaurant chain that would become Gus's empire, the Chicken Brothers, a name that carried in it the bond between them. They were partners in business, and, as the show strongly implies, partners in life, two men who had built something together out of nothing, and who were bound by love as much as by ambition. The creators of the series and the actor who played Gus have all spoken of understanding the relationship as a romantic one, even though the show never states it outright on screen, leaving the deepest truth of it implied rather than declared, in keeping with how much of Gus was always kept hidden. Max was a chemist and a gifted one, and together he and Gus developed a product of remarkable quality, a strain of methamphetamine purer and better than anything on the market. They had ambitions for it. They wanted to sell it widely, to build something large, and to do that, they needed the cooperation of the cartel that controlled the trade in that part of the world. So they sought a meeting with the man at the top, Don Eladio, the Don of the cartel, hoping to strike a partnership that would give their product global reach. Gus, being Gus, engineered the meeting through a clever and underhanded maneuver, distributing samples to Eladio's men in a way that forced the Don's attention. It was a calculated move, the kind of patient manipulation Gus excelled at. And it was also, as it turned out, a fatal miscalculation, because Eladio did not respond to cleverness the way Gus expected. The meeting took place at Eladio's hacienda, beside his pool, in the warm, open air. Gus and Max made their pitch, and Eladio, far from being impressed, was insulted. He felt that Gus had been disrespectful, that the underhanded way the two men had secured his attention was a sign of disrespect, an attempt to manipulate him that could not be allowed to stand. Despite the apologies of the two men, Eladio decided to make an example. He ordered his enforcer, Hector Salamanca, to deliver the punishment, and there, at the poolside in front of Gus, Hector shot Max once through the head. Max fell, pleading for his life in his final moments, and his blood ran out into the clear water of the pool, while Gus was forced to watch, held in place, made to see the person he loved most in the world destroyed before his eyes. The composed, controlled man that the world would later come to know broke in that moment. He wept. The mask had not yet been built, and the grief poured out raw. Eladio spared Gus's life, and the reason he gave is one of the most important and most mysterious lines in the whole story. He told Gus that the only reason he was not being killed alongside Max was that Eladio knew who Gus really was. He warned him that he was not in his home country anymore, that the protections and the power he had once enjoyed did not reach this place. The line implies a past, a history, a former identity that carried enough weight that even the Don of a cartel hesitated to kill its owner. And Hector, twisting the knife, told Gus to stick to chicken, to go back to his restaurant and forget any ambition beyond it. The two men who had murdered Max and humiliated Gus let him live, believing him broken, believing him harmless, believing they had put a presumptuous businessman back in his place. It was the greatest mistake either of them would ever make. They had not broken Gus. They had created him. From that day, the man who would become the Gus Fring the world remembers began to take shape, forged in the fire of that loss. The grief did not fade and it did not heal. It hardened, it compressed, it transformed over the following decades into something cold and patient and absolutely relentless. A revenge so total that it would consume the rest of his life and organize every choice made. Gus did not lash out. He did not seek immediate vengeance and get himself killed, which is what a lesser man ruled by feeling would have done. Instead, he did the most disciplined and terrifying thing imaginable. He swallowed the grief, buried it beneath a perfect calm, and began to build, slowly and quietly, the machine that would one day destroy the people who had taken Max from him. The discipline examined earlier, the patience, the concealment, the empire itself, all of it grew out of this single purpose. He would make himself powerful enough, and patient enough, and hidden enough to bring down the entire cartel, and he would take however long it required. He even bent the appearance of submission to serve the plan. Eladio forced him, after Max's death, to become a distributor for the cartel, to work for the very people who had murdered his partner. And Gus accepted. Outwardly compliant, a loyal associate doing the cartel's business north of the border. But the compliance was a disguise, like all his other disguises. While he appeared to serve them, he was building his independence in secret, constructing the hidden laboratory that would one day free him from needing them at all, accumulating the resources and the leverage and the infrastructure that his revenge would require. He spent years pretending to be a tamed and useful subordinate, while every day moving a little closer to the destruction of the men he served. The patience this required, the years of swallowing pride and hatred and grief while smiling and doing the work, is almost beyond comprehension. But Gus had made a promise to a dead man, and he intended to keep it, no matter how long the keeping took. The revenge, when it finally came, was as cold and complete as everything else about him, and he delivered it at the exact place where it had all begun. Years later, having maneuvered himself into a position of strength, Gus Hunts returned to Eladio's poolside, the same poolside where Max had bled into the water. He brought with him a bottle of expensive tequila, a gift, a gesture of friendship and reconciliation. The tequila was poisoned, to prove it was safe and to win the trust of the men he intended to kill. Gus drank from it himself first, swallowing the poison along with them, willing to risk his own death to make the deception complete. Then he excused himself and quietly forced the poison back up, while, behind him, Eladio and the assembled leaders of the cartel began to die, one after another, around the same pool where they had murdered the man he loved. It was a mass killing of stunning audacity, and it broke the back of the cartel's power. The patient promise of decades was fulfilled in a single afternoon, in the precise location of the original wound, with a calm that turned the whole thing into something almost ceremonial. But Eladio was only part of the debt, and the slowest and most personal part of the revenge was reserved for Hector Salamanca, the man whose hand had actually fired the shot. With Hector, Gus did not want a quick death. He wanted the long suffering described in the story about the wounded animal. When fate left Hector confined to a wheelchair and robbed of his speech, Gus kept him alive in that state on purpose, visiting him, taunting him, savoring his helplessness. He engineered the destruction of Hector's family piece by piece, manipulating events so that Hector's nephews and allies fell one after another, making sure that Hector lived long enough to watch everything he cared about be stripped away. The grief Gus carried for Max became a campaign of grief inflicted on Hector, a deliberate mirroring, a determination to make the man who had taken his loved one experience the loss of everything in return. The revenge was not only about killing, It was about making the killer suffer the same kind of wound he had inflicted, drawn out across years, exactly as Gus had drawn out the suffering of the animal in his story. This is the secret at the center of the philosophy of Gus Fring, and it reframes everything else about him. The discipline that seemed so admirable was the discipline of a man holding in an ocean of grief and rage. The patience that seemed so superhuman was the patience of a man who had been waiting decades to avenge a murder. The empire that seemed so impressive was never an end in itself, only a means, a weapon being slowly forged for a single purpose. The fear he used to control his people, the concealment he used to hide from the law, the cold competence that defined him in every scene. All of it existed in service of a love that had been destroyed and a promise that demanded payment. The man who appeared to feel nothing was, in truth, a man who felt one thing so powerfully that it had reorganized his entire existence around it. He had not escaped his grief through discipline. He had weaponized it. And here lies the deepest tragedy of him, the thing that makes his story more than a tale of a clever villain. The revenge that drove him also imprisoned him. A man whose entire life is organized around avenging a loss can never truly move past that loss, because moving past it would mean giving up the purpose that holds him together. Gus could have taken his fortune and walked away at any point. He never did, because there was always one more piece of the revenge left to complete, one more enemy left breathing, one more debt left unpaid. The promise to Max kept him chained to the very people who had hurt him, unable to rest, unable to heal, unable to imagine a life that was not built around the wound. The love that had once lifted a poor, young chemist out of the slums had curdled, after his death, into a thing that consumed the man who carried it. Gus mistook his revenge for devotion, and in a way it was devotion, but it was a devotion that left no room for anything else, including his own peace. The grief and the revenge explain why Gus did everything he did, but they do not explain everything about him, because at the very root, beneath even the loss of Max, there was a deeper darkness that the show chose never to illuminate. Where Gus came from, who he had been before he ever met Max, what had happened in the country he fled, and why even a cartel Don feared to kill him. All of this was left deliberately in shadow. The man without a past was the most powerful version of the character, and the blankness was a choice. That deliberate mystery is the next piece of the philosophy to examine, the empty space at the center of Gus Fring that the writers guarded all the way to the end. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. We have reached the engine that powered everything, the murder of the man Gus loved, and the decades of patient revenge that grief became, paid out in poison at a poolside and in the slow torment of an old enemy. Next, we look at what came before, even that the past Gus never spoke of. The blank space where his history should be turns out to be one of the most deliberate choices the writers ever made. Section 8, The Man Without a Past. Of all the choices the makers of these shows made about Gus Fring, the most powerful may have been a choice about what to leave out. For all the depth they gave him, all the backstory they revealed about Max and the cartel and the building of his empire, there remained one part of his life they never explained, a blank space at the very center of the man where his origins should have been, where Gus came from, who he had been before he ever arrived in the world the audience knew, what had happened in the country he fled, and why even a cartel boss feared to kill him. All of this was left deliberately dark. The man had no settled past, and rather than weakening him, that emptiness made him larger, more frightening, more impossible to fully grasp. The mystery was not a gap the writers forgot to fill. It was a feature they protected with great care all the way to the very end of the franchise. What is actually known about Gus's origins is small, and even some of it comes from unreliable sources, including Gus himself. He was from Chile. This much is treated as solid. He is referred to more than once as the Chilean, and he speaks of having grown up poor there, of a childhood of hardship and want. He emigrated, leaving Chile, and passing through Mexico before establishing himself further north, sometime in the years when his story with the cartel began. And here, the firm ground runs out almost immediately, because the records of his life before that emigration have, according to the show, simply vanished. There is no paper trail, there is no documented history. When the question of his past comes up, Gus waves it away with an explanation that raises more questions than it answers. He says that the fascist government that ruled Chile in those years destroyed a great many records, and that his among them are simply gone. That explanation points at something real and dark in actual history, and the show uses the real history to deepen the fictional mystery without ever spelling out the connection. Chile, in the years Gus would have lived there, was ruled by the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, a regime that held power from the mid-1970s into 1990, and that was responsible for widespread repression, the disappearance of thousands of people, torture, and the destruction of records to hide its crimes. This is settled historical fact, the real backdrop against which Gus's fictional life unfolded. By placing his origins inside that period and that country, the writers wrapped him in an atmosphere of state violence and buried secrets, without ever having to say what role, if any, he played in it. The mystery of Gus became entangled with one of the genuinely dark chapters of recent history, and the entanglement lent him a weight and a menace that no invented backstory could have matched. The hints the show does provide are tantalizing, and they are also, importantly, just hints, fragments that point in directions without ever arriving. The most significant comes from the cartel Don who spared his life. Eladio told Gus that the only reason he was not killed alongside Max was that Eladio knew who Gus really was, and warned him that he was no longer in Chile. The line strongly implies that Gus had been, in his former life, a person of real significance, someone with connections or a position powerful enough that even a cartel hesitated to simply execute him. What exactly that significance was, the show never says. Eladio knew, the audience never does. The Don carried the secret of who Gus really was to his poisoned death, and the writers let it die with him. There are other fragments scattered through both series, each one suggestive and none conclusive. The same Don and his enforcer Hector taunted Gus with a mocking nickname that translates roughly to a grand military title, a word implying a general or a commander. It could be read as a reference to some actual rank Gus once held in the apparatus of the regime, or it could be read as pure mockery, a jeer at a man they assumed had been mixed up in the authoritarian government back home. The show does not settle which. There is also Gus's relationship with a German businessman, an associate he had known back in Chile, a man tied to the large foreign corporation that helped back Gus's operation. Gus once spoke of how he and this man had barely escaped Chile with their backs against the wall, and how the German had saved them both in that desperate moment. The remark implies that something happened in Chile dangerous enough to require a narrow escape, something the two men shared and survived together. But what it was, the show leaves blank. These threads have led viewers to construct elaborate theories, and it is worth naming clearly that they are theories, interpretations built on fragments, never confirmed by the show itself. Some have proposed that Gus was an intelligence officer in the Chilean regime, a man trained in surveillance and logistics, and ruthlessness which would explain the operational genius he later displayed. Some have connected his German associate and the talk of a narrow escape to a real and notorious settlement that existed in Pinochet's Chile, a closed German colony that served the regime as a site of detention and torture, a place founded by a man with a dark history of his own. The theory imagines that Gus might have been involved with that place or others like it, that the crimes of his youth might have been far worse than anything he did in the drug trade. It is a compelling idea, and it fits the fragments, but it remains speculation. The show never confirmed it, never depicted it, never gave it more than the faint suggestion that the fragments allow. Anyone who states it as fact is filling the blank with their own imagination, which is exactly what the writers designed the blank to invite. Even the references to a specific incident, repeatedly hinted at but never shown, follow this pattern of deliberate withholding. Characters mention something that happened in the city of Santiago, an event that seems to carry great significance, that hangs over Gus and shapes how others regard him. An enemy invokes it knowingly, suggesting it reveals the true ruthlessness beneath Gus's businesslike surface. The phrase comes up in both series, treated as a key to understanding the man, and yet the event itself is never depicted, never explained, never resolved. The prequel series, which ran for years and filled in the backstories of so many characters, which showed in detail how Gus built his secret laboratory and waged his early war with the Salamancas, ended its entire run without ever telling the audience what happened in Santiago. It was, by the end, the single largest unanswered question about the character, and the writers chose, with full awareness, to leave it unanswered. This was not laziness, and it was not an accident. It was a sustained artistic decision, maintained across 2 series and many years, and it reveals something about how the writers understood their own creation. A villain who is fully explained becomes a problem the audience can solve. Once you know exactly what made a man the way he is, you can file him away, comprehend him, in a sense, contain him. The fear shrinks because mystery is a large part of what makes a figure frightening. The writers understood that the power of Gus lay partly in what could not be known about him, in the sense that there was always more darkness behind him than the audience could see. By refusing to explain his deepest origins, they kept him permanently larger than the screen. A man whose full history remained beyond reach even after everything else had been revealed. The blank was the source of his depth. To fill it would have been to make him smaller. There is a way in which this withholding is the perfect expression of the man's own philosophy, and the connection is worth drawing out. Gus spent his entire life concealing himself, hiding in plain sight, dividing his identity, keeping his true nature sealed away from everyone around him. He was a man defined by what he hid, and so it is fitting, almost poetic, that the show itself treated him the way he treated the world, concealing his deepest truth even from the audience, keeping his origins as hidden from the viewer as his criminal life was hidden from his city. The mystery of Gus is not just a storytelling device imposed from outside. It mirrors the inner reality of the character. He was unknowable to the people in his life by design, and the writers extended that design to the audience, ensuring that even those watching from the outside, with access to so much, would never fully know the man either. The concealment that was his philosophy became the show's philosophy about him. It is worth noticing, too, how this mystery interacts with his own unreliability as a narrator of his own life. The childhood story he told about the tree and the animal, examined earlier, contains a small detail that does not fit the country he claimed it happened in, a creature that does not belong to that part of the world. This has led to the suspicion that even the stories Gus told about himself may have been partly invented, shaped for effect, designed to reveal or conceal as suited his purposes in the moment. If even his own accounts of his past cannot be fully trusted, then the blank at his center grows deeper still, because there is no reliable witness to who he truly was, not even the man himself. Gus may have rebuilt his own history, edited it, buried parts of it, until the truth was lost even to him. A man who fled a country whose records were destroyed, who reinvented himself entirely in a new land, who lied as a matter of daily survival, becomes a man whose real story may simply no longer exist anywhere, not in any document, and perhaps not even in his own memory in any honest form. The emptiness at the center of Gus Fring is, in the end, part of what makes him feel so real and so enduring. Real people are not fully explained either. The deepest sources of who a person becomes are often buried, lost, half-remembered, tangled up in histories that no one fully knows. By refusing to hand the audience a clean origin story, the writers made Gus more like an actual human being and less like a constructed character, a man with genuine depths that could not be plumbed, with a past that shaped him in ways even he might not have fully understood. The mystery was a gift to the character, the thing that lifted him out of the category of memorable villains and into something closer to a genuine enigma, a figure people are still trying to understand long after his story ended. The writers knew that some things are more powerful left in shadow, and they left Gus partly in shadow on purpose. And the shadow is a large part of why he endures. That carefully guarded mystery, though, sat on top of a philosophy that did have one genuine flaw, one crack that all the discipline and concealment in the world could not seal. For all his control, for all his patience, for all his hidden depths, Gus carried within him a single weakness, a need that ran counter to everything else he believed, and in the end, that weakness was the thing that killed him. The man who hid everything could not quite hide one desire, and that one desire opened the door through which his enemies finally reached him. The flaw in the armor is the next thing to examine, the one place where the perfect system failed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. We have stood at the empty center of Gus Fring, the past in Chile that the writers guarded to the very end, and seen how that deliberate blankness made him more powerful than any explanation could. Next, we find the single crack in the armor. For all his control, Gus carried one weakness that ran against everything he believed, and it was the opening his enemies needed. Section 9. The crack in the armor. A system that is perfect in every part can still fail because of a single flaw. And the more perfect the rest of the system, the more dangerous that one flaw becomes. Gus Fring built himself into something close to flawless. His control was total. His patience was bottomless. His concealment was seamless. His use of fear was precise. By every measure, he had constructed a way of living that should have made him untouchable, and for a very long time it did. And yet he died, lured into a trap and destroyed, and the trap worked, because of the one place where his perfect system had a crack. For all his discipline, Gus carried within him a single weakness, a need that ran directly against everything else he believed. And his enemies, once they understood it, used it to kill him. The flaw was not a lack of control. The flaw was the one thing his control could not reach. It was his pride, and more precisely, his need to be seen winning. The weakness centered entirely on Hector Salamanca, the man who had fired the shot that killed Max. Everywhere else in his life, Gus was a model of cold efficiency. He killed when killing served a purpose, and he did it cleanly and moved on. But where Hector was concerned, the efficiency broke down, replaced by something far more personal and far more dangerous. Gus did not simply want Hector dead. He wanted Hector to know that he had lost. He wanted to stand over his enemy in the moment of his defeat and have that enemy look him in the eyes and acknowledge, even silently, that Gus had won, that the man Eladio and Hector had once dismissed and told to stick to chicken had outlasted and outmaneuvered them all. This need, the need for recognition, for the satisfaction of being witnessed in his triumph, was the one appetite Gus never managed to discipline away, and it would prove fatal. The show planted this weakness carefully, long before it paid off. There is a recurring moment, returned to more than once, in which Gus stands before the helpless Hector and demands that the old man look at him. Hector, confined to his wheelchair, robbed of his speech, stripped of everything, still possesses one tiny scrap of power, and it is the power of refusal. He will not give Gus the satisfaction. He will not meet his eyes. Again and again, Gus asks for that look, that acknowledgement, and again, Hector denies it to him, staring stubbornly away, withholding the one thing Gus truly wants. In one of these moments, when Hector refuses yet again, Gus tells him, with quiet menace, that perhaps next time he will. The exchange seems small, almost a footnote in the larger story. It is, in fact, the seed of his destruction. Gus has revealed, to Hector and to the audience, that he needs something from his enemy, that there is a hunger in him that the killing alone will not satisfy, a hunger to be seen and acknowledged in his victory. This hunger was a genuine deviation from his philosophy, and that is what made it so dangerous. Everything else about Gus was oriented toward purpose and away from feeling. He did not indulge himself. He did not take unnecessary risks for the sake of satisfaction. He subordinated every personal desire to the cold logic of the operation and the long plan. But the need to triumph over Hector, to be present for it, to witness and be witnessed in the final defeat of the man who had taken Max, was a personal desire that he could not fully subordinate. It was the place where the grief that powered him broke through the discipline that contained it. The revenge had always been the engine, but the engine was supposed to serve the plan. Where Hector was concerned, the plan began to serve the revenge instead. And that inversion, that letting of feeling take the wheel, was exactly the kind of weakness Gus had spent his whole life despising in other men. His enemies understood this, and they used it with precision. Walter White, cornered and desperate, facing a Gus who had threatened to murder his entire family, needed a way to kill a man who was almost impossible to reach. Gus was too careful, too well protected, too disciplined to be caught in any ordinary trap, and so Walt looked for the crack, and he found it in Gus's hatred of Hector. Walt went to Hector, the broken old enemy, and recognized that Hector hated Gus even more than he hated Walt, that the old man would welcome any chance to strike back at the person who had tormented him for so long. Walt proposed an alliance, a scheme that would cost Hector his own life but would take Gus with him. Hector agreed, because his hatred of Gus was the one fire still burning in his ruined body. The trap was built on the certainty that Gus, given the chance to finally finish Hector, personally to be there for the end, would not be able to resist coming in person, and that certainty was the key to everything. Gus could have had Hector killed in 100 safe and distant ways. He was a man who built layers of separation between himself and violence, who almost never did the dirty work himself, who protected his own person with obsessive care. But Hector was the exception. This was the one death Gus wanted to deliver with his own hand, the one ending he needed to witness directly, the one moment he could not bear to delegate. So when the opportunity came, when circumstances seemed to offer him the chance to finally end Hector face to face, Gus did the thing he almost never did. He went himself. He walked into a room to personally kill the man who had murdered Max, drawn there by the need to complete his revenge in person, to be present for the moment he had waited decades to reach. His enemies had counted on exactly this, had built their entire plan around the prediction that the disciplined man would, for this one death, abandon his discipline. They were right. The rigidity of his system made him predictable, and predictability is death for a man whose survival depends on never being anticipated. This is the hidden danger of a perfectly controlled life, and it is worth dwelling on because it is the deepest irony of the character. A man who is wildly unpredictable, ruled by impulse and chaos, is hard to trap precisely because no one can guess what he will do. Gus was the opposite. He was so disciplined, so consistent, so governed by his patterns and his principles, that once his enemies understood those patterns, they could predict him with confidence. His visits to Hector were a pattern. His need to confront his enemy was a known quantity. His obsessive vendetta was a lever that could be pulled. The very control that made him so formidable also made him legible, readable, a system that could be studied and then exploited by anyone patient and clever enough to find its single weak point. The armor that protected him everywhere else had one seam, and the seam was always in the same place, and his enemies aimed for it. There is a broader truth about Gus contained in this, and the whole arc of his story illustrates it. Control and power were his greatest strengths, and they were also, in the end, his fatal weaknesses, the same qualities viewed from two different angles. His need for control made him build an empire and a perfect disguise, and it also made him rigid and unable to adapt when his patterns were turned against him. His desire for revenge gave him the patience and drive to become extraordinary, and it also clouded his judgment where Hector was concerned, pulling him into the one situation his discipline should have warned him away from. The hubris of a man who had won so many times, who had outmaneuvered everyone for so long, who had come to believe in his own perfect control, left him unable to imagine that his oldest enemy and a desperate chemistry teacher could possibly bring him down. He had grown, perhaps, a little too certain of his own mastery, and certainty is its own kind of blindness. It is striking, looking at the whole shape of it, how the flaw connects to the love at his core. The crack in the armor was not greed, not lust for power, not any of the ordinary weaknesses that bring down ordinary criminals. The crack was grief, the same grief that had powered everything good and terrible about him. His need to triumph over Hector, to be seen winning, was at bottom a need related to Max, a hunger to make the man who had taken his love acknowledge what he had done and answer for it personally. The weakness that killed Gus grew from the same root as his strength. The wound that had made him formidable was also the wound that made him vulnerable, and there was no separating the two. To remove the flaw, he would have had to remove the grief, and to remove the grief, he would have had to become someone else entirely, someone without the engine that had driven him to greatness in the first place. The thing that made him was the thing that unmade him. He could not have one without the other. This is the final lesson hidden inside the philosophy of Gus Fring, and it is a lesson about the limits of control itself. A man can discipline his behavior, his words, his face, his patience, his violence, almost everything about how he moves through the world. What he cannot fully discipline is the deepest source of why he does any of it. Gus could control nearly everything except the wound at his center, and the need that wound created, and that one uncontrollable thing was enough to bring down the entire perfect structure he had built on top of it. The most disciplined man in his world was destroyed by the one desire he could not master. And the desire was, in the end, a kind of love, twisted by loss into a need for vengeance so personal that it overrode even his own survival instinct. The crack in the armor was the place where the human being still lived inside the machine. And the human being, for all of Gus's efforts to bury him, was still there at the end. Still grieving, still needing, still reaching for an acknowledgement he would never receive. That reaching led him into a small room in a quiet building, to the bedside of the enemy he had waited so long to destroy, certain he was about to complete the work of his life. What happened in that room? And the strange and perfect way Gus met his end is where the whole story finally comes to rest. The death of Gus Fring is one of the most remembered moments in television, and it is remembered not only for its shock, but for a single small gesture in its final seconds, a gesture that summed up everything the man had ever believed. To close the story of his philosophy, that ending has to be looked at directly, the trap that closed around him, and the last thing he did before the end. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. We have found the single crack in the armor, the need to be seen winning that pulled the most disciplined man in his world into the one trap his enemies could build. His own grief turned against him at last. Next we reach the end, the small room and the final gesture. The death of Gus Fring summed up his entire philosophy in a single quiet act, and it is where his whole story comes to rest. Section 10. The tie and the verdict. Every philosophy is tested most truly at the moment of death, and the death of Gus Fring is one of the most remembered moments in the history of television. It is remembered for its shock, for the sheer audacity of how it was filmed, but more than anything it is remembered for a single small gesture in its final seconds, a gesture so perfect and so revealing that it has come to stand for the entire character. In his last living moment, mortally wounded, with half his face torn away by an explosion, Gus Fring straightened his tie. He did not scream. He did not collapse in panic. He reached, in the last seconds he had, for order, for composure, for the same dignity he had carried into every room of his life. To understand what that gesture means, and what it says about everything he believed, the whole circumstance of his death has to be laid out, because the way he died was the final and clearest expression of how he had lived. The trap, as we have seen, was built on his single weakness, his need to personally destroy Hector Salamanca. Walter White had engineered a situation that played on this need with surgical precision. Hector was made to appear to have turned informant, to have spoken with the law, and to a man like Gus, there was no greater crime, no deeper betrayal of the code he lived by. Gus had nothing but contempt for a man who would talk to the authorities. He regarded such a person as no man at all, as something small and broken and beneath dignity. And so, believing that Hector had crossed this final line, Gus resolved to end him personally, to go to the quiet nursing home, where the old man was kept and deliver the death he had waited decades to deliver, with his own hands at last. The need to be present for it, the need to finish the revenge in person, drew him exactly where his enemies wanted him. He was careful even then, careful as always. His enforcer swept the room for any hidden danger, checking for the kinds of traps a cautious man would expect. But Walt was patient too, and waited until the sweep was complete before planting the bomb beneath Hector's wheelchair in the one window when the room would not be checked again. Gus, satisfied that it was safe, entered the room to do the thing he had come to do. He carried with him the means of a quiet, controlled killing, the kind of precise and personal end he had imagined for so long. He stood over his old enemy and spoke to him, and the moment arrived that Gus had been chasing for years. Hector, who had refused for so long to give Gus the acknowledgement he craved, who had withheld his gaze again and again to deny Gus that one satisfaction, finally looked him in the eyes. The cruel perfection of the moment is almost unbearable. Gus had wanted that look more than anything, the recognition, the acknowledgement, the sense of being witnessed in his triumph by the man he had defeated. And in his final living moment, he received it. Hector looked at him at last. But the look was not the look of a defeated enemy accepting his loss. It was a look of pure, blazing wrath, the face of a man who had found one final way to win. Hector held Gus's eyes and began to ring his bell, and Gus understood, a fraction of a second too late, what was happening. He saw the bomb. He tried to rise, to flee. There was no time. The explosion tore through the room, killing Hector and Gus's enforcer instantly, and leaving Gus himself mortally wounded. The acknowledgement he had hungered for across all those years was delivered in the same instant as his death, and it was the trigger of that death. The look he had demanded was the look of his killer. His deepest weakness handed him both the satisfaction and the destruction at once, inseparable in a single final glance. And then came the gesture that no one who has seen it ever forgets. Gus walked out of the ruined room into the corridor. For a moment he appeared almost untouched, composed, upright, moving with the same steady dignity he had always carried. Then he stopped, and with a calm that seemed impossible. Given what had just happened, he reached up and straightened his tie. Only as the camera moved around him did the truth become visible. The entire right side of his face had been blown away by the blast. He was already dead in every way that mattered, his body simply not yet aware of it. And those final seconds, with half his face gone, the last thing Gus Fring did was adjust his tie, restore his appearance, compose himself one final time. Then he fell to the floor, dead. The actor who played him has spoken about what that gesture meant, and his understanding of it goes to the heart of the whole character. He saw the tie straightening as the act of a man returning, in his final moment, to the thing he had always done, the defining habit of his entire existence, so that he could be complete in his leaving of the world. It was composure performed past the point of death, control maintained even when there was nothing left to control. Faced with the end, stripped of everything, his body destroyed, Gus reached instinctively for order, for dignity, for the appearance of being in command. It was the truest thing he could have done, because order and dignity and the appearance of command were what he had built his whole life around. He died exactly as he had lived, refusing to be seen as anything less than composed, refusing to let even death make him appear to have lost control. The gesture was the philosophy made flesh one final time, the perfect summary of everything he had ever believed, compressed into a single quiet act in the last seconds of his life. It is worth knowing that this moment was extraordinarily difficult to create, that it required 19 separate takes, and the combined work of makeup artists and visual effects specialists to achieve the haunting image of the ruined face above the composed body. The care taken in making it matched the care the character would have taken with anything, a fitting tribute to a man defined by meticulousness. But the technical achievement, impressive as it is not why the moment endures. It endures because it is the truest possible ending for this particular man. An ending that tells the audience everything about who he was without a single word of explanation. A lesser show might have given Gus a speech, a final monologue laying out his thoughts on death and revenge and the meaning of it all. This show gave him a straightened tie, and the silence of that gesture says more than any speech could have. He was, to the very last instant, a man who controlled the surface, who maintained the mask, who would not be seen losing even as he died. Now, with the whole story laid out, the philosophy of Gus Fring can finally be weighed. And the weighing has two sides, because the philosophy offered real things and it cost real things. And an honest reckoning has to hold both. What it offered was a way to win in a brutal world, a way to survive and build and endure where louder and weaker men destroyed themselves. The discipline gave him a steadiness so one could shake. The patience let him outlast every rival and build an empire from nothing. The concealment kept him free for years while others fell. The control over himself and over everyone around him made him the most powerful figure in his world, a man who frightened killers and outmaneuvered cartels and hid a vast criminal operation behind a fast food counter. Judged purely as a method for achieving power and survival, the philosophy worked and worked spectacularly for a very long time. Few people in any world, real or fictional, have ever exercised such complete mastery over themselves and their circumstances. But the cost was equally real, and it was enormous. The same philosophy that made Gus powerful made him profoundly alone. The discipline that protected him sealed him off from every genuine human connection. The concealment that kept him safe meant that no one ever truly knew him. The fear he used to control his people ensured that he was surrounded by obedience and empty of love. The revenge that drove him chained him forever to the people who had wounded him, leaving him unable to rest, unable to heal, unable to imagine any life beyond the pursuit of a vengeance that consumed everything. He had a fortune he could not enjoy, an empire that gave him no peace, a perfect control that left him imprisoned inside his own restraint. The man who appeared to have everything had, in the deepest sense, given nearly everything away, trading every human comfort for control and purpose, until there was almost nothing left of him that was not strategy and grief. The philosophy did not bring him happiness. It is not clear that happiness was ever something he believed was available to him after Max died. The philosophy brought him power, and power was the thing he reached for, in the absence of the thing he had truly wanted, which was a life with the person he had lost. There is a deep and quiet sadness in the whole shape of it once the pieces are assembled. Gus Fring was, at his root, a man who had loved someone and lost him in the most brutal way imaginable, and had responded to that loss not by breaking but by building, by transforming his grief into a machine of patient destruction. The control, the discipline, the concealment, the empire, all of it grew from a wound he refused to let heal. He mistook his revenge for devotion, and perhaps in some way it was devotion, but it was a devotion that allowed no room for anything else, that turned a man capable of love into a man capable only of waiting and hating and controlling. The boy who had once nursed a tree back to health and sold its fruit to survive became a man who poisoned his enemies at a poolside and kept a broken old foe alive for years simply to make him suffer. The capacity for care was still in him somewhere, buried under everything, surfacing only in a hidden scholarship given in a dead man's name. But it had been almost entirely consumed by the thing his grief became. And in the end, the philosophy that had served him so well could not save him from the one thing it could never address, which was the wound at its own center. Gus could control his behavior, his face, his patience, his violence, almost everything about how he moved through the world. He could not control the grief that powered all of it, or the need that grief created, the hunger to be acknowledged in his triumph over the man who had taken Max. That single uncontrollable thing was the crack through which his enemies reached him, the one human desire that all his discipline could not master, and it pulled him into the room where he died. A life built entirely on control ended because of the one thing he could not control, his own buried heart, still grieving, still needing. After all those years of perfect restraint, the machine had a man inside it, and the man was his undoing. So the verdict on the philosophy of Gus Fring is a divided one, and it should be, because the man himself was divided, two faces held together by a discipline that never let the seam show. As a method for surviving and winning in a dangerous world, his way of living was nearly without equal, a masterpiece of control and patience and concealment that few could ever match. As a way of being a human being, it was a tragedy, a slow trading away of everything warm and living in exchange for power that brought no peace and a revenge that brought no rest. The straightened tie in his final moment captures both at once. It is magnificent, a display of composure so complete that it survives even the destruction of the body. And it is heartbreaking, the act of a man so imprisoned by his own need for control that he could not stop performing it even as he died. A man who would rather appear composed than be comforted, even at the very end. He hid in plain sight so completely that he hid even from himself, and the hiding held all the way to the floor. That is the philosophy of Gus Fring, taken apart piece by piece. The stillness, the code, the patience, the concealment, the fear, the grief, the mystery, the flaw, and the final gesture that tied them all together. A man who built a perfect system on top of a wound he would not heal, who won everything and kept nothing, who controlled the entire world around him and could not control the one thing inside him that finally brought him down. He served chicken with one hand and ran an empire with the other, and somehow both were true, and the truest thing of all was the tie he straightened with half his face gone. The last act of a man who would not, even in death, be seen as anything less than in command. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.